Hey, what's up guys? This is Rick with the Digital Divide, and today I want to talk about the Nintendo 64. This is a console I have so much nostalgia for. I remember getting it under my Christmas tree along with a copy of Mario 64, and I had fun with this console for so many years until I eventually ended up trading it in for a Sega Saturn and fell in love with that console as well. Like any list, this is completely subjective. These are my personal thoughts and opinions, so if you're wondering why a game like Zelda is not on my list, well, it's because I didn't like it all that much on the Nintendo 64, so it makes no sense for me to include it on my favorites list. That said, let's get started with Wave Race, which is my first choice here, and this is a game most of you are probably familiar with. It is absolutely one of the best games ever made. The water rendering in this game was a revolution when it came out, and to this day still looks really, really good. The physics behind it, the way that it affects your craft is so impressive. And more importantly, though, the game is just really, really fun. The course variety is unparalleled. There's so many hidden unlockables that you can find in the game, which gave it some replayability. There are even courses that will change every time you do a lap because of weather. When I started collecting the Nintendo 64 again, this was the very first game that I picked up. Next game I want to spotlight is CONKER'S Bad Fur Day, and I have no idea how Rare convinced Nintendo to let them make this game, because it is a very, very R-rated game where you are controlling a drunk squirrel. There's a lot of sexual innuendo, there's a lot of violence. It makes no sense for this to be on a Nintendo platform, but somehow they managed to get Nintendo to approve it, and it's such a funny game. It also features full voice acting, and they were able to cram all of this into one cartridge. Again, don't let the cute aesthetics fool you. This is not a game for kids. I'm going to leave you with this clip so you can get an idea of what kind of sense of humor this game has.
Uh-oh.
Me. I am the great mighty Pooh, and I'm going to throw my shit at you. A huge supply of tish comes from my chocolate starfish. How about some scat, you little twat?
The next game I want to talk about is Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. This is a really fun side-scrolling Kirby adventure platformer. If you're not familiar with Kirby, he has the ability to absorb other people's powers by eating them. And when he does that, he has a one-time use ability that he takes from the enemy. It's kind of similar to Mega Man in that every time he defeats an enemy, he gets their powers. The level variety in this game is really fun. It takes place from a 2D side-scrolling perspective, but everything is rendered in 3D, and they do take advantage of that sometimes with dynamic camera angles, and this is just a really, really fun game. If you can find it, I highly recommend picking it up on the N64. So we might as well get this one out of the way. Super Mario 64, I'm sure, is a game that everyone is familiar with. It is arguably the best launch title that has ever been released with any piece of hardware. It was an amazing accomplishment at the time. It still holds up today, and it is unbelievable when you think about it, because this was Nintendo's first attempt at an open-world 3D Mario game, and they absolutely nailed it on their first try. This game is so much fun, and again, as I mentioned before, this is the game that I got on Christmas Day alongside my Nintendo 64s. This is obviously just a must-have if you own the system and you like 3D platformers. The next game I want to talk about is OGRE Battle 64. This is the best strategy game on the Nintendo 64, in my opinion. It's not for everyone. You know, there's a lot of pre-planning when you go into battles, because while you're actually in active combat, you're not controlling the characters. It's all done automatically, but there is strategy involved. When you're in the world map, you're doing a lot of planning ahead of time. This game has a real rock, paper, scissors dynamic, very similar to something I would say in the vein of Advanced Wars that came out on the Game Boy Advance, that while you're actually in combat, it's all automatic, but you're planning and strategically moving your pieces around the map like a chessboard. The game is also very, very expensive. Here we can see it went for $100. This one sold for $280, but it did come with two other less expensive games. This one sold for $350. This one, when it says hot sale, this is a reproduction cartridge, so that's why it only went for 25 bucks. Here's a legitimate one that went for 130. This one went for 130, 150. This is a reproduction for 28. But hey, if you just want to play the game, there's nothing wrong with buying a reproduction. Next game I want to talk about is Banjo-Kazooie. This is a very, very fun 3D character-driven platformer in the vein of something like Mario 64. I absolutely love the gameplay in this game. My only gripe with it, and this is something that Rare does a lot, is I hate it when there's no proper voice acting and the characters just make a series of like nonsensical like noises every time they talk. That always annoys me, and that's why when they made CONKER'S Bad Fur Day, I was glad that they went to proper voice work. But I can understand that given the limitations of the cartridge. The game is incredibly fun and features a wide variety of levels. One second you're in an Egyptian tomb fighting a mummy, and the next you're in a Christmas-themed level where you're fighting snowmen, and it's such a fun game. Highly recommend picking this one up. It did get a sequel on the Nintendo 64 as well as the Xbox 360 after Microsoft acquired Rare. Next game I want to talk about is Ridge Racer 64. I love the Ridge Racer series, and this is a great entry in the series. It came later into the Nintendo 64's lifespan, but if you're into arcade racers that have a heavy emphasis on drifting, this is an absolute must-play. In my opinion, it is so much fun. The graphics at the time were not mind-blowing by any stretch of the imagination, but they were rock solid, and the game ran at a very consistent, even frame rate. Again, the most important thing is this game was just incredibly fun. There was a nice track variety. There was a lot of visual enhancements to the PlayStation original and a bunch of really cool tracks, so highly recommend this one if you are a racing fan. Next game I want to talk about is Paper Mario 64. If the name wasn't obvious for you, this is a game where the entire aesthetic is made to look like you're inside of it, like a storybook, and everything is made out of paper. They called it Paper Mario, but really this is more like a spiritual successor to Super Mario RPG. This game is very much a traditional RPG. It has a turn-based combat system. So essentially, you're running around the world, you're exploring, and everything has this cute, paper-like aesthetic, but every once in a while you're traveling, you'll bump into a bad guy, and when you do that, it switches over to a traditional turn-based combat system that you would see in something like the old-school Final Fantasy games, but with a Nintendo flair. So each move has a really clever use of traditional Mario powers and themes, and this is just a really fun game. If you can find it, I do recommend picking it up. The next game I want to talk about is Nightmare Creatures. I recently featured this game in my horror games that I think you should check out if you're a fan of horror games. Now, I will say that I prefer the PlayStation 1 version over this version, but it's still a really rock-solid port. And I recently picked up a copy of the Nintendo 64 version just to check it out because I had never played that version before. And it's a really great port, and I highly recommend checking this one out, really because there just aren't a lot of games like this on the Nintendo 64 that are more mature-themed horror games with blood and dismemberment, so definitely recommend this one. The next game I want to talk about is Perfect Dark. This game really takes benefit of the expansion RAM cart for the N64 and boosts the resolution. And in my opinion, this game is miles ahead of GoldenEye as far as playability and the variety of levels and weapons and gadgets. This is just so much more fun, in my opinion. I would recommend picking this one up over GoldenEye any day of the week. It really features on spycraft and gadgets, and it is very, very similar. It's made by the same developer as GoldenEye, so some of the death animations and the character models are gonna look very familiar if you've played that game. But this one is the one I would recommend picking up. The next game I want to talk about is Star Fox 64. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this game. It actually came packed in with Nintendo's Rumble Pack. At the time that this game released, it looked amazing. Like, the waters featured full-on reflections, and the fluidity of the controls, thanks to the analog stick, were just incredible. And this is a really fun game. It has a really good variety of different objectives. It is not just a on-rail shooter. There are levels where you have full control over which direction you're going. So this game had a lot of variety. The original, if you've played on the Super Nintendo, was just an on-rails shooter. This one had a lot of variety. There were some on-rails levels, and then there were some completely open-world levels, and then there were some levels where you're on the floor driving a tank. So it's not air combat at all. And this game also featured multiple paths that you can take. So every time you play the game, you can choose to branch off in a different direction and check out new levels and new bosses that you didn't get to see the first time around. So there's so much variety baked into the game. The next game I want to talk about is Excitebike 64. This is a fantastic game. It's so underappreciated on the N64. And yes, it is a direct sequel to the one that came out all the way back on the 8-bit Nintendo. Now, it's funny, the original is actually unlockable in the new game, but the new game obviously features much more advanced graphics and really amazing physics. So while you're playing the game, it has a real sense of momentum and weight to it. And it has a ton of variety. There's some modes where you're racing, there's some modes where all you're doing is seeing how fast you can climb up a really steep mountain. And again, what makes this so fun is the physics. This was one of the first games like this that had come out. This was before, the Xbox 360 and those kind of dirt track-based physics games. There were even more exotic racing levels, such as this forest where you're racing in the middle of a rainstorm, and visually this was super impressive at the time. You really got to play it to get a feel of the controls, but I can't recommend this one highly enough. I think it's one of the most underrated racing games on the system. Moving on to another racing game, I think everyone here is familiar with Mario Kart 64, and that's because it is an absolute classic. It's so much fun. My only gripe with it today is that I wish they hadn't gone with two-dimensional sprites for the characters. All the backgrounds are in 3D, but all the character sprites are two-dimensional, and I don't think they hold up as well as something like Diddy Kong Racing, for example. But the most important thing here is that the game is incredibly fun to play. It's got a nice variety of tracks as well, although compared to the track design of the modern games, it's a little bit simplistic, but still a lot of fun, and featured some really great multiplayer components too. This was fun to play with a group of friends. The next game I want to talk about is TUROK 3, Shadows of the Oblivion. This game is absolutely incredible. It was a complete reboot of the TUROK series in that the main character dies and you have to take over the mantle. It's a very serious, story-driven game.
All is already lost.
Adon, I don't understand any of this. What burden, what choice? None of this makes any sense.
One of you must take up the mantle. One of you must become the son of stone. One of you must become TUROK.
The death of your brother leaves us no choice. Only TUROK may take up the burden. Only TUROK may wield the light.
So this was a very atmospheric, scary, spooky game. In the first game, you were in the jungle fighting dinosaurs. There really wasn't much of a story at all. This game is all story-based. It has full-on voice acting. The graphics were some of the best that I'd ever seen on the Nintendo 64. You're not fighting, dinosaurs. You're stuck in this city, and it's got a very spooky horror vibe to it. You're fighting these creepy monsters. There's even parts of the game where you're outside, and it is almost completely open world. The police have the city walled off so that these monsters can't get outside, but it is a really impressive game to this day. The enemies are just really, really creepy looking. As you can see here, I don't even know what that is, but it's disturbing on multiple levels. The gameplay was really fun. The visuals were a step ahead of any other TUROK game that had come out before it. And I can't recommend this one enough. You really, really need to give it a shot. Because a lot of people, I think, were burned out with the TUROK franchise at the time that this came out, and they were moving on to other systems, but it is really, really good. It also featured full character shadows, and I had never seen that before. Traditionally, in a Nintendo 64 game, it would just feature like a little blob underneath the character. This one had fully rendered, accurate shadows, and the monster design or boss design was incredibly creepy. In this example, the monster that we see here that is contained looks like a Cthulhu, straight out of H.P. Lovecraft horror novel. It's just really, really cool. The next game I want to talk about is another horror game. It is Resident Evil 2. I don't know how Capcom managed to squeeze this game onto the Nintendo 64. This is one of those impossible ports that they said couldn't be done, and that has to do with the size of the game. On the PlayStation 2, this game was massive. If I'm not mistaken, I think it took up 2 entire discs, and that's massively more storage that you could squeeze onto a Nintendo 64 cartridge, but they were able to squeeze everything into one cart, including all of the super high quality, fully CG movie cinematics. And granted, they were highly compressed, but it was still insanely impressive to see at the time because a lot of people thought it could not be done. This was one of the games that came out later in the Nintendo 64's lifespan, and it is pretty pricey if you're looking to pick it up, but I highly recommend it. It's a great port of the game. The next game I want to talk about is Super Smash Bros. This game is an absolute classic. Now, this is not the style of fighting game that I traditionally play, but at the time of release, something like this really hadn't been done before. This was before the MCU, where you had all of these characters that were not connected and never really interacted with each other in other games. They were all standalone game franchises, and this game took that and just combined all of these characters into one crossover event, something along the lines of like Avengers, but for Nintendo characters, and it was really cool to see and so much fun, especially in multiplayer. You could get 4 of your buddies together on the couch and just have at it with your favorite Nintendo character for hours on end. It was so much fun. The next game I want to talk about is Killer Instinct. This is my favorite fighting game on the N64. It's a more traditional fighting game and had an awesome soundtrack. This game had an absurd amount of options that you could choose from, and you could crank the gore all the way up to the max. You could turn off doubles or jugglers or finishers. There were so many options to customize the game to be exactly what you wanted it to be. And the graphics at the time were really, really great. All the backgrounds were 3D and took advantage of the Nintendo 64 hardware. And again, the game had an awesome soundtrack and the controls were spot on. Because the game used 3D backgrounds, that allowed the developers to get some really awesome camera angles during some of the finishing moves. Last but not least, I want to talk about Sin and Punishment. This is the only Japanese exclusive on my list, and it's weird because although it only came out in Japan, all the voice acting is in English, which is odd.
Saki! Oh, Saki! Good morning, Saki.
Good morning, Iron.
Come on, we've got work to do.
So this game is an on-rails shooter, and it is very, very, very stylistic. The controls are very, very smooth. This game is just so much fun, and there are some levels in this game that have a sense of scale that no other game on the Nintendo 64 could really match. The game has a ton of variety in that it constantly shifts your perspective on what's going on, and the enemies will change their tactics level by level. Sometimes it'll switch to like an isometric top-down perspective, and the types of enemies that you're fighting are completely different than what you were doing the level before, so you really have to adapt level by level, and again, it's really, really, really fun. This last level kind of gives you an idea of the scale. This ship is just towering over your character, and at the time this was so impressive to see. It was like a video game version of an anime that you were playing live, and it was just absolutely incredible and highly recommended if you can import this game.
Here we go. You will get us through this crisis.
Alright guys, that's going to do it for me today. As always, thanks for watching, and let me know if there's anything that you love on the N64 that I missed in this list.